Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, May 13th, 2024, and I'm the host of the show, Dr. Cara Santa Maria. This week, we have a great conversation for you, but before we dive into it, I do, as always, want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. Remember, Talk Nerdy is and will always be 100% free to download, and the way that we make that work is by relying on listener support from folks just like you. This week's top patrons include Anu Bharavaj, Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, David Compton, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo, Joe Wilkinson, Pasquale Gelati, Riva Keith, and Ulrika Hagman. Thank you all so much. If you'd like to pledge your support on an episodic basis, all you've got to do is visit patreon.com/talknerdy. All right. This week, I had the opportunity to chat with Dr. Sarah Thornton. She is a sociologist and an author focusing on art, design, and people. She's written several books, including 7 Days in the Art World and Club Cultures, Music, Media, and Subcultural Capital, which was based on her PhD thesis. She has a brand new book out called Tits Up: What Sex Workers, Bra Designers, Milk Bankers, Plastic Surgeons, and Witches Tell Us About Breasts. That's what we're going to focus on today. So without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Sarah Thornton. Well, Sarah, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Cara.
So I'm excited to talk about your new book, Tits Up: What Sex Workers, Milk Bankers, Plastic Surgeons, Bra Designers, and Witches Tell Us About Breasts. And so before we get into all of the things that you learned in your research for this book and all the kind of lovely and quirky and fascinating things that you ended up writing about, I want to know about, your personal relationship to the breast and what made you want to kind of dive into this topic.
Well, in 2018, I had a double mastectomy and reconstruction. I was one of the very lucky ones insofar as I went into the surgery expecting to have cancer, and they just pulled out a lot of atypical cells, ductal carcinoma in situ, and I feel like I dodged a bullet. I'd been monitored for 7 years, and I'd had so many biopsies. So, it was after I'd had the reconstruction, I kind of woke up, I guess you could say, after kind of many months of fear and fatigue. And I really was very confused. I was not clear on what I had lost. And I also had implants, which really did not feel like they were part of me. They felt like these alien imposters. I actually nicknamed them Bert and Ernie because they were like Muppets. They didn't have any of the sentience of our breasts. And it was like the intelligence of our breasts is not something that's talked about. Quite the contrary, actually. I still have a friend, actually, and she was so frustrated by being treated like a bimbo just because she had large breasts that she joked that she wanted to put on her business card, PhD, double D.
Right.
So there is, unfortunately, like a long kind of history of associating breasts with stupidity, which kind of fuels into our use of the word boobs, which I grew up with. And my mother called them boobs, and I called them boobs forever. But when I started doing this research, I started thinking, hey, booby traps, booby prizes, the boob tube. Why is it that this important body part that's so emblematic of womanhood is denigrated and treated like it's a stupid loser? And, I guess I'd kind of been part of that school of thinking. I really had not relished my breasts. I was not a woman who loved my cleavage. I think I'd had some personal experiences as a teenager that made me fearful of presenting my cleavage, due to my sexual safety. And so I really felt like I'd lost something, but I really didn't know. I was very unclear about what it was. And I just started, I did two things, actually. I started reading and reading and reading. And I also wrote an essay called A Brief History of My Boobs. And it was kind of a way of reconciling myself to the history of my original set, and kind of trying to come clean on my own personal psychology of breasts. I am not a psychologist, I'm a sociologist, so I tend to look beyond the individual to the social group. And but I knew, I had to deal with the personal. And and then I started reading and reading and reading. And I realized that actually, there were most of the writing, and there is a lot, is very siloed. So, there's stuff about breastfeeding, and there's stuff about breast cancer. And then there's a little bit about, sex work and stripping, but mostly it doesn't talk about breasts very much. And then, my mother was a feminist, and I was brought up as a feminist. And I thought, well, the women's movement has got to have something to say about this. And, and then I dove into all these classic, I reread some books, and I then embarked on reading a lot within feminism, and I found basically a huge absence that, that the women's movement, for perhaps very good reasons, had focused on wombs, vaginas, and uteruses, and had not really considered breasts significant. And I think, through further reading, I tried to fathom why was, and I think there were several factors. Back with first wave feminism, when they were going for the vote, the suffragettes, they wore, their long dresses with high collars and a banner across their chests, almost canceling out their chests, that would say things like votes for women. They adopted military regalia. And it seemed to me significant that they would kind of cancel out their breasts in that way. And I think that motherhood and biological womanhood, if there's such a thing, let's just say biological femaleness, for lack of a better word, had been associated with many characteristics that would deem women unworthy of the vote. So, and it goes back to really Carl Linnaeus. And we can always delve into that story. He is the taxonomist who coined the word mammalia and also coined the term Homo sapiens. And he was actually raised to be a Christian minister in the Lutheran tradition. And but he was passionate about science and moved into a different realm, but still very cautious about what the church might think of his work. And it was still not common thought that human beings were animals. It had been known back with Aristotle that humans were animals, but the Christian tradition really tried to separate humans from animals, and suggested that man, and in the specific sense, of course, was made in the image of the divine. And Carl Linnaeus, in the 18th century, very cleverly came up with a way to take this kind of sexism into science from
Yeah.
religion.
And made it an art that continues to this day.
Exactly. Breasts, despite the fact that, all humans have mammary glands, only women's mammary glands develop into something pronounced and functional for the most part. And men could be, so women could be associated with mammalia and with mammals and with the lactating breast, and men could be Homo sapiens, the wise ones, made in the image of the divine. And so that is like a very long-winded way of tracing back the history of this dismissal of dumb boobs. But I think it was, the person who excavated that history is a historian of science at Stanford called Londa Scheibinger, and she won an award for a history essay, and I think about 1993 or 92 on this very topic. But it's one of the things I really had to dig out of the archive, because despite the importance of her research, it had never really been popularized, and certainly not amongst women in the women's movement. So what I came to realize was that there had been very little consciousness raising done around breasts within the women's movement, and that patriarchy still was kind of embedded in our chests. And many women are kind of, I don't know what the right word to say, but are don't want to think hard about this part of their body, because the prevalent meaning is that breasts are erotic playthings for men, and then also kind of crazily, secondarily, something that should keep us in our place in the home, as maternity has done historically. Now, obviously, that is no longer the case for many women in America, but it would seem that breasts are still kind of unexplored in a critical way. And when I started doing my research, I had some like really great feminist friends over in Berkeley, and I actually had a 3-year scholar in residence position attached to women's studies. And, but, I had some colleagues in other parts of the university who were like, breasts? Why would you write about breasts? As if there was nothing less feminist than breasts. And that's kind of amazing to me. And, so yes, I think, the women's movement has been kind of uncomfortable with, our chests, and for many reasons. I mean, you interviewed Julia Serrano not long ago, and I actually cite her book, Whipping Girl, in my introduction, because one of the things she says is that she thinks the women's movement made a huge strategic error in seeing femininity as an evil. And breasts, of course, are associated with femininity, and I'm inclined to agree. I am very grateful to the wonderful progress that the women's movement has brought about. We do happen to be in a time of backlash, and I do think it's helpful, perhaps, to look at our bodily autonomy from different points of view. And for me, it became like the mission of the book was like, what is the top half of women's liberation? Like, what does it mean to be pro-choice from the waist up?
You mentioned that you tend to agree that this sort of, I don't want to call it like sexual, it's a sexualization or an eroticism, like a doing to these body parts that historically these women's movements kind of wanted to hide or cover up or not associate with their femininity because of all of the shame, because of the male gaze, because of the patriarchy. And so how did that affect, like, that sort of frame that we've been seeing historically? How did that affect kind of how experts write about this, who's writing about it, what the archives you were digging into look like, and how you continued your sort of investigative work, your research for this book?
Well, that is a complicated question, but I love that question. And so I love reading, but I am basically a fieldwork person. So I'm an ethnographer. I love going out, doing in-depth interviews, sustained observation, what anthropologists called participant observation. And so and I can't remember, and I don't even know if I could tally them up, like between 60 and 80 interviews, I realized where the freshest insights were coming from. And it wasn't actually, the gynecologists or the feminists, or even the dancers. I ended up identifying kind of 5 clusters of experts who then I had revolving around or kind of inhabiting different environments. So chapter 1 is called Hardworking Tits. And I will talk about language in a minute if you'd like to. And it's set in a strip club. A strip club here in San Francisco called the Condor, and a historic strip club. And I don't just deal with the insights from strippers, but I deal with sex workers of all kinds, and including Carol Lee, the woman who coined the term sex work, who had worked as a prostitute for many years, coined the term sex work, and unfortunately passed away last year. But so basically, the reason I started there is because the dominant notion of breasts in America is that they're erotic playthings, is that they're sex objects. So I thought, hey, I'm going to go to the professionals. I'm going to go to the gals who make a living from this particular version of breasts. And I was astonished by what I found. Then chapter 2, life-saving jugs, I knew I had to have a breastfeeding chapter. Breastfeeding is the reason why women have breasts. Women do not have breasts to attract men or anybody. And actually, breasts have not been eroticized for all that long. It really starts in the Renaissance in France amongst the aristocracy when they started hiring wet nurses as a matter of kind of absolute tradition. And certain French kings started to develop kind of fetishes for the breasts of their mistresses, the unused breasts of their mistresses, because their mistress would bear their children, but of course a wet nurse would feed them. So they would have these pristine, perky, unengorged breasts. And also, if you look at anthropological evidence, it is by no means universal that breasts are perceived as sexy or erotic. And, if you grew up in a tribe where men and women are both top free, not naked, because of course often they'll have necklaces or tattoos, or they don't perceive themselves to be undressed exactly, they're in their public role. But, if you've looked at your mother's breasts and your sister's breasts and you've seen women breastfeeding, all around, they're not really that sexy. And they're not, they're a sensitive body part like our ears or our necks. They're sensitive without being, the equivalent of a clitoris. you
Yeah,
know?
I mean, it's just to interject, I feel like something that, I don't have children and I don't so I'm not passing some of these lessons on to my progeny, but there's one place that I love to go here in Los Angeles, which is like a Korean spa, a jjimjilbang. And one of the cultural traditions of going to the jjimjilbang is that there is a sort of co-ed portion where everybody's wearing like t-shirts and shorts and it sort of looks like you're all in the same cult and you go into the saunas together and you eat noodles. And then there is the separate section, which is the wet room, sauna and spa. And that's fully nude. Culturally, it's fully nude. You're not to wear bathing suits. You're not to wear any clothes. And one thing that I've often thought when I spend time in the jjimjilbang is how important it is for young children to be around bodies of all sorts of different shapes and sizes and types and just be exposed to the human form in what I feel like is such a deeply non-eroticized, non-sexual, very fundamental way. Like, because old grandmas and little babies are all just running around in that spa. And there's something really lovely and freeing about being able to just be in your skin and your skin not being under the male gaze.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's very healthy. And many people have talked to me about that, the opportunity to be naked in non sexual situations, sometimes same sex, sometimes co ed. I One of the problems in our culture is that unless we're in an intimate relationship, our our opportunity to see nude people, they're usually young, idealized nude people, whether it's in Hollywood movies or in porn if we watch it. And
Actively
as
engaging
we
in
know,
sex or sexual
yeah,
things. Yeah.
yeah. So, yeah. So just going back to what I was saying, some men and fewer women, but some men are really astonished to hear that the only reason women have breasts is to hydrate, immunize, and nourish the young. And that's why I use the word jugs for this chapter, because in some languages there are many slang words for breasts that relate to lactation, and in English there are not. There are actually 700 words in English for breasts, according to one study. Yeah, 700 words. Most of them are used by men, and a fair percentage of them are arguably misogynist. So I use the word tits for a lot of reasons. One is because it's the number one word used on the internet. And my book is an attempt to reclaim our top halves. And I believe in the power of language to help us do that. And, if you talk to a lot of women in America, they have retreated into using two words. If they're white, they'll use breast and boob. And if they're black, they're likely to use breast and titty. And then you talk to a man and he'll rattle off a load of words, rack, tits, knockers, melons, fun bags. They're having fun with it. And we're in a place of shame. And that goes down. I even talk to teenagers. I talk to high school students, and that's where it really is astonishing when you talk to, boys of that generation, and they're like, they have literally they could name 20 words for boobs, and those are the words they actually use with their mates on the football team or whatever. Whereas the girls are like, boobs, in a kind of shy
Mhm.
way.
Yeah. But how much of that sort of female relationship with our own anatomy is driven by the patriarchy and the male gaze?
Well, I would say it's about patriarchy, but it's way more than the male gaze. I would
Okay.
say um, it's not just about optics. It's like literally invaded our bodies.
Yeah.
It's like I think women don't listen to their breasts in the way they could, partly because they're perceived as like dumb, stupid, irrelevant appendages in some sense. So, like when you're pregnant and you often start to notice a lot of changes, but then you can retrospectively go, oh my God, you know what? My boobs always were telling me when I was pregnant. When I was expecting my period. Or, my boobs would actually convey fear, to me, or vertigo, or, I've heard lots of stories about the way, um, uh, nipples are actually connected to our emotions. And it becomes most obvious when you've just given birth and there's all this change going on, and there's this reciprocal relationship between infant and mother and all of that kind of thing. But I think that our attention is very selective in the busy world we live in, and we're told to listen to our bodies, but we still listen in a very selective way, I guess.
Oh yeah, and I think it's a skill. We have to learn it to listen to our bodies.
Totally. So then, my going through the experts. So what I did, I was like, how do you make breastfeeding interesting? And when I first started hearing about the 33 human milk banks that are scattered across America and that actually save the lives of infants in the NICU, and then I thought, oh, if I'm going to talk to breastfeeding women, I want to talk to those high capacity donors who've donated like gallons and gallons and gallons of milk. These women are heroes in almost every definition I could come up with. Especially because sperm donors are often considered heroes, and you can see that on like the cryobank websites, celebrating those dudes. Bless them. They are doing a public service, but they do actually get paid, whereas these human milk donors do not. Anyway, so that chapter revolves around human milk banks, and one specifically, the oldest human milk bank in America, which is in San Jose. While I was writing the book, another milk bank sprang up, the UC Health Milk Bank, which is based in San Diego. And they're a really great institution doing a lot of scientific work because they're affiliated with the university. Anyway, rambling. Chapter 3, treasure chests. Those are plastic surgeons. They are my experts in that part of the book. And maybe that's the most predictable of expert on the breast. But what I would say is that and then chapter 4, I've got bra designers, and I'm actually behind the scenes in Old Navy with the gals who have made like best-selling sports bras, big-selling swimwear, and also now constructed bras. And then finally, in chapter 5, Holy Memories, I'm in the Redwoods with a group of nature worshiping neo-pagan feminists, spiritual feminists who call themselves witches, hence the witches of the title. And that was because I kind of understood early on somehow that religion was really impacting our perspective on breasts, even if we're not religious at all.
Right.
The Garden of Eden, it has a lot to answer for in shaming our relationship to our bodies. So anyhow, so my experts became sex workers, lactation consultants and milk bankers, and these high capacity donors, plastic surgeons, bra designers, and these witches who are very well read in religion, often came from multiple religions, and tend to have day jobs in the caring professions. A lot of them were actually psychotherapists, midwives, nurses, and teachers. That was really the predominant day jobs that they had. So anyhow, then these experts led me to like different political issues, almost all of which were sidelined by the mainstream women's movement. And in the way, I guess, that breasts had been, and it was totally unexpected to me. And it was only in the course of researching the chapters that it became clear. So, sex workers have historically been marginalized by the women's movement. It's been very uncomfortable. I mean, until very recently, now the National Organization of Women was like campaigning against the decriminalization of sex work, despite the fact that it impacts poor women, Black women and women of color, and trans women very significantly, puts them between a rock and a hard place in terms of being between organized crime and the police. And the police do not have a great record when it comes to sexual violence, unfortunately, and predation and exploitation.
What was the rationale for the women's group to be actively campaigning against decriminalization?
They could fall back on old tropes, infantilizing sex workers as if they were kind of duped.
Yeah, that they're all victims. Yeah.
Yeah. And I also think they just really do not make the distinction between consenting adult sex workers and trafficking victims, the victims of sexual trafficking. And there are super significant distinctions between the two, obviously.
Absolutely.
And, as one of, as I quote in the book, the difference between a sex worker and a victim of sex trafficking is the difference between a wife and a victim of domestic violence. Not all wives are the victim of domestic violence. So, yeah. So, and then again, the women's movement has not really been active in fighting for the right to breastfeed, fighting for the governmental support of breastfeeding, of frankly, maternity leave is a general failure in this country, given that we're the only, well-developed country in the world that doesn't have paid maternity leave for even 6 weeks, let alone 3 months.
But is that because the women's movement hasn't fought for it, or is that because the people who are writing this legislation are generally male?
I would say both. I think that the American women's movement has for a very long time prioritized the right of women to be like men. And that is one reason why abortion being the right not to have children, which I absolutely believe in and endorse, and it, has been the priority issue. I'm not saying it shouldn't be the priority issue. I'm just saying, what about the rights of women once they've had a child? The poorest group of people in the country are women with children, single women with children. And, then when you deprive a woman of having an abortion and she has an unwanted child, then, and often plummets her into poverty, and then there's so little support.
100%. I agree with that.
And then
I guess I kind of disagree with the framing, though, that that feminist movements have historically pushed for women to be more like men. Like, I don't see that as being more like men, not having children. I just see that as having more choice.
I'm with you 100%. I would say, what surprised me, because I didn't realize it, because, you have your friend group and you're like, but most women in America actually are mothers.
Oh yeah, that doesn't surprise me.
I wouldn't have known that as like an academic, let's say.
Right. Yeah, that's true. We've got a very biased sample of who we spend time with.
Yeah, totally. We I would almost say that it would be more like 50-50 in terms of my close girlfriends about whether they have a child or.
Yeah, my group's probably the same way. Yeah.
And sorry, I just lost an earbud. I will put it back 1 second. Sorry. And so motherhood has generally been an uncomfortable subject. It goes back to Betty Friedan. The general movement wanted to be liberated from motherhood, liberated from femininity.
And the cult of domesticity and sexual violence.
Exactly.
And
so
all
I
of
would
those things.
say that, and a lot of women, it's interesting, like various women I've interviewed who do not see themselves as feminist. The reason they say they're not feminist is because they enjoy their femininity, love being a mother, and appreciate the attention of men. And
Which, there's nothing about that's anti-feminist. But it's funny that they've sort of been socialized to think that is anti-feminist, or at least non-feminist.
Exactly. So, and also I had one of my student apprentices go through the entire back catalog of Ms. Magazine. And it's very interesting because it's not the whole world of feminism, but it's kind of an indicator of the times. And it's interesting. Breasts get almost no coverage. Breast cancer would be the number one thing. When breasts come up, it's about breast cancer. And like almost nothing on breastfeeding, as if it weren't a feminist issue.
Right. The right to be able to breastfeed in public, the right to have spaces in your workplace to breastfeed safely, healthily, and comfortably, the right to be able to carry your milk on an airplane. Like there are a lot of political issues around this that I think are only recently gaining traction, and maybe they're only amplified in my worldview because I have friends that are active, like they're activists in that space.
Yes. Absolutely. And also, did you know that the biggest buyer of formula, cows-based breast milk substitute in the world is the U.S. government? And by the same token, they do not support human milk banks. They do not support lactation consultants. They have never fought for insurance to cover lactation consultants. The Pumping Act, yes, your insurance has to buy you a breast pump if you have insurance, of course. And so, crazily too, the biggest buyer of formula is not the Department of Health, it's the Department of Agriculture. So it's basically a dairy subsidy.
Yeah.
And
wow.
why? And that formula goes to the women and infants and children's programs that support poor women, and hugely, biased towards women of color. And, I don't even know where to start with that.
So you're saying that basically like insurance has to cover a pump. And we, of course, have government programs that subsidize infant formula for women or families who qualify for WIC, but that insurance is not required to cover lactation consultants?
That's true. And what's really crazy is since the Cancer Act of 1998, the Women's Rights and Cancer Act of 1988, fact check the exact phrase, insurance has had to cover implants.
Interesting.
In the event of a double mastectomy. So that tells you a lot about American culture too.
Right, and our
happen to have
priorities.
been the beneficiary. So I happen to be the beneficiary of that. I actually, as an issue of equity, it's really important that women be able to equally access breast reconstruction, whether it's with their own body tissue or with implants. And I happen to have a couple of implants, and for me, they're better. They were better than going flat. I just wasn't ready to do that. It didn't feel right for me. I've always been more femme than my wife. And, I actually kind of felt nauseous and panic stricken at the thought of losing my breasts completely. And, these are imposters, and they're definitely not as good as the originals, but somehow they oddly give me a bit of comfort. And
and that's and I think that your experience is not uncommon. In my experience working with obviously women with breast cancer, I think that's not an uncommon experience, but of course it is your experience. And like you said, to have the availability, to have the option, if you are a woman who underwent a mastectomy, is so important for equity. But of course, it's not the option that everybody chooses. And I've known many women who chose not to have a reconstruction.
oh, totally. Only 40% of women who have mastectomies opt for reconstruction. And I really admire the women who didn't. Truly, I think it's a brave, um, it's a brave decision. It takes a strong sense of self.
And for some, it's a
And
decision based on their wellness and their quality of
yes,
life, because reconstruction requires very often pain. It
another
can require
surgery.
a whole other surgery. It can require these stretchers that they put inside. It can require
Ugh,
a lot of
yeah.
downtime. Yeah, it can be quite
I
painful. So
hate those
some, it's not worth
expanders.
it. Expanders, that's what they're called. Yeah.
I still remember those expanders.
Yep.
Hated them.
Yep. Yeah. Some
And
women are like, not going through that. Nope, not worth it to me. And some are like, I will 100% go through it in order to feel the way that makes me empowered and that makes me feel the way I want to feel.
exactly. So it's really interesting to me that the federal government has recognized that need, but they haven't recognized the importance of human milk to the health of the next generation. And so, we live in a culture with chronic obesity and diabetes, which is absolutely correlates with formula, and so
Do you think it's a
yeah,
danger? Like, I don't want to say a danger zone, but I can see, maybe not from a policy perspective, but I can see both sides of a sort of public discourse on this. And I don't want to make it a two-sided thing because I think it's
yeah,
probably many-sided, but the the protection of women to choose not to breastfeed or to not breastfeed if they struggle to breastfeed and not be sort of shamed from making that decision and made to feel culturally like they are doing less than for their child, or like they are inducing some sort of future harm, when the evidence isn't great that, like, babies don't still thrive so long as they get appropriate nutrition. But on the flip side of that, allowing and making all sorts of maybe not allowing, but like supporting, that's a better word, supporting the efforts of women who are struggling to breastfeed but really, really want to, in a meaningful way. I feel like it sort of takes all types. What's your take on that?
well, I am pro-choice in all respects. So I absolutely support a woman's right to choose to breastfeed or not breastfeed. But of course, what we do know about choices is it's rarely a level playing field. And actually, the evidence is pretty great about the advantages of human milk over formula. And actually, the Association of Pediatricians has shifted its recommendations to recommending 2 years of breastfeeding. So the evidence is actually huge. But of course, even with the choice to have an abortion or the choice to breastfeed, these choices are not easy. They're not made in equal environments.
Right. And they all have a risk benefit analysis that none of them are clean.
Totally.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
so, one of the heroes in the book is an African American lactation consultant based in the poorest part of Oakland. Her name is Brandy Gates, and she worked at the WIC office there, and she got the rates of the women she was working with up from 7% to 33%. And her argument with me was that, well, a lot of people resent the fact that formula companies use the language of the women's movement around choice
Right.
to market their cow-based formula milks.
Right. They've
So
kind of
that
co-opted it and hide underneath it in order to just make money, right? In order to be
right.
a
So
capitalist
that's a
driving
little
force.
bit of an irritation, but
Right.
as far as she's concerned, her women, choice is a privilege because her women are so poor they can't afford formula. You go into a your local Safeway, the formula is locked up along with the expensive bottle of whiskey, you know, and and that is painful. And she talks about how the WIC offices give them formula, but often not enough formula through the whole first year, let alone 2 years, you know.
But yeah, I mean, like breast milk is, I don't want to say, I don't know, this is kind of a loaded thing to say, but like breast milk is free. I mean, of course, you have to have adequate nutrition as the mom, and you have to have, there's a lot of things that have to line up to be able to breastfeed your baby appropriately and enough and all of that stuff. But ultimately, your body makes this stuff.
Yeah,
You don't have to pay for it.
absolutely. Organic, farm to table, right
Yeah,
there and ready.
exactly.
And so, yeah, it's a really complex issue. Um, and to be honest, American breastfeeding rates, considering that there's no paid maternity leave on a federal basis insured, is does pretty well with breastfeeding rates.
And that includes
Interestingly,
women who pump and feed their babies, the
totally.
milk that they produce. Yeah, and that could be why, because there is like relatively good access to technology to allow women to do both.
Exactly. And um, yeah, so I mean, France, I go to Norway and France in this chapter to look at two cultures on opposite ends of the spectrum. So Norway has the highest breastfeeding rates in the developed world, and France has the lowest.
Oh, I had no
And
idea.
that's really interesting. France is the original location of the sexualized breast. And they are also a big dairy country, dairy producer. And they also are still the home of high fashion and lingerie and beauty products. Not to say that these things aren't made elsewhere, but you know, I having interviewed my bra designers, they go to Paris every year to check out what's being made there so that they can come back to America and, you know, borrow this detail from that bra and think about this color and all of that kind of thing. Work with that class, that hook and eye.
It's a fascinating, even thinking about like lingerie design, this industry that is marketed towards women, but implicates so much of the male gaze and implicates so much sexualization and eroticization, but at the same time, this ability to reclaim our bodies, whether we feel in a sexual way or in a non-sexual way for ourselves. It's such a fascinating, I mean, how did you even parse this stuff out as you were writing about this? Because it's all so, um, I don't know,
Dense.
dense and
It's so,
like complicatedly interwoven.
I mean, the book did take me 6 years to write.
Right.
So
Well, there you go.
that's one answer. It was like doing a second PhD, although, as a, you know, kindness to my readers, I made sure it was very readable.
Right. It's not an
And
academic text, that's for sure.
no, it is not. I really, so I think one of the ways I do it is because I have characters and, in locations, I kind of build the stories through many different voices. And by the time you get to the end of a chapter, and then by the time you've read another chapter, your knowledge of, of breasts as complex, layered with meaning and sensation and um, function, it gets so rich that I mean, I've had various people tell me that it kind of completely improved the self-esteem they had for their chest. And it's not because, one of the things I argue, like, what is a liberated rack? Well, certainly a liberated rack has no particular appearance. And I use the word rack because not only is a rack a cut of meat close to the ribs, we put our clothes on racks. And I think about all the cultural baggage we hang on racks. And, our breasts have so many rich connotations, and we have not really thought about them very much. And so when it comes to religion, I focus on the positive stories, the life affirming stories. I interviewed she's now in her 80s, the first professor of divinity at Harvard, who wrote a book on the lactating Madonna and how this was a symbol of God's love for humanity, and quite a significant contrast to Christ on a crucifix, suffering for mankind, and stories in the Torah. And my favorite really is within Hinduism. There's, because they have a goddess tradition, and many of them are quite buxom. There's a kind of celebration of breasts as powerful things. There's one legend that comes out of the Tamil region where a woman is so angry that she takes her breast off her chest and throws it into Madurai, and the whole town burns down.
I love
it. Yeah. So
it's a beautiful sort of counterpoint in some ways to what we're kind of talking about at the beginning of the conversation. And in my mind, I make a parallel to the episode where I got to interview Rachel Gross about her book Vagina Obscura, and we talked a lot about like the pudendum and these different anatomical words that literally translate to like the shame organ, and all of the ways that historically, and even obviously to this day, some of these sexual or genital or dimorphic gender associated organs, body parts have been, viewed as something shameful, as something to be eroticized, as something that little girls have to cover up for fear of wandering eyes of creepy old men. And that carries us throughout the day. This sort of, I don't know, this reclaiming and this taking back the power in those areas where we were born into a culture where it had already been taken.
Yeah.
Before we were born, this was the way that things were.
I mean, I think the great thing about reclaiming our breasts is formula purchasing and maternity leave aside, we have the power to do it now. It's actually a kind of consciousness raising project. And obviously there are equity issues all over the place, but, we can take our chests seriously. We can refuse to dismiss them as dumb boobs. We can refuse to be judgmental about other women's choices about what they do with their chests. Luckily, they're women's gazes and healing gazes, gay gazes. My first degree is in art history, and I actually remember writing one of my undergraduate essays on the male gaze based on Laura Mulvey's very influential essay on the topic from 1975. And it's still true, of course, but you only have to watch Bridgerton to note that the female gaze is powerful somewhere.
Oh yeah,
because there's a lot of gratuitous male torso in there, and and hey, watch any Matthew McConaughey rom-com, and you see a lot of gratuitous torso there too. And you can feel that. But I mean, I think that the denigration of breasts is really an unexplored part of our culture, and it's really important to appreciate them in all senses of the word, in terms of like almost uplifting them or elevating them, because they are emblematic of womanhood, and they're even more emblematic of our gender than they used to be, because because of the way the transgender theory and memoirs and movement is shifting our understanding of gender from our genitalia up towards our presentation, our gender presentation, which is so much more around the top half of our bodies. And so, it's really interesting to look at the fact that trans men, the number one surgery they have is a mastectomy or a masculinization. And for trans women, hormones are often enough to create a chest and a breast, I should say, and to feminize the chest. And then, of course, augmentations with implants are also an option, but they're much less practiced. Much less common.
I didn't realize that. That is interesting.
Yeah, it's a 2-to-1 discrepancy, and so I mean that's in a way how I think that's partly about how a masculine chest or a flatter chest is the generic chest, the universal human chest, the kind of chest of Buddha, the chest of Jesus, and that the breasted chest is the specific denigrated chest.
Right. And of course, that's not naturally. Right. That's through cultural normativity.
Totally.
Yeah,
exactly. No. Yeah. Not absolutely. No, all of this is
not essentially.
All of this is in quotation marks. I am a sociologist of culture. And so yes, please don't misunderstand, or please my apologies if I'm using shorthand.
No. And I think along that line, one question that I think is an important one, mostly for similar reasons to what we were just talking about, has to do with choice and with, in a conversation about celebrating something that was long denigrated and sort of reclaiming and owning and freeing the nipple and, like being very, very proud of the feminine form and all of these things as a form of feminism. I think that there is the unspoken premise there that we need to dive into here as we're closing the show. And I'll give you I'm
dying to talk about free the nipple, actually.
Oh, okay, great. Maybe you can bring that up too while we're doing it.
Yeah.
But I want to give you sort of a paralleled experience of mine as a model for this, and I'll keep it kind of tight. But after my hysterectomy, because this was like during all the Roe v. Wade stuff that was going on, and my experience was very similar to yours. It was adenocarcinoma in situ. This was the treatment. I did not want to keep undergoing so many biopsies. I knew I was eventually going to have to do it, but there is no reconstruction for a uterus because it's on the inside of our body, right? Like they didn't put an implant uterus and fallopian tubes in me. They just took my uterus and my fallopian tubes, and that was it. And there was a period that was and I'm in this group, a very, very trans activist group that was being careful about language and saying over and over, people with a uterus, in order to not exclude certain individuals from conversations about Roe v. Wade. But sometimes the negative consequence of that was that I was feeling emotionally, not necessarily cognitively, like somehow does that mean I'm less of a woman now that I don't have a uterus? And so I want to make sure we save space to talk about the women who did do a double mastectomy and don't have visible breasts, or the non-binary individuals who are gender fluid, who like to wear binders and like to reduce those those sort of secondary characteristics, but still feel feminine in their way. And I think that, I wanted to open the floor to you for an exploration of that, because I don't think it's implied, but I think if we don't talk about it explicitly, it can be misinterpreted that a celebration of tits means if you don't have tits, you're not feminine.
Oh, I totally agree with you. And I would not want to imply that. And of course, I actually hesitate from celebrating them.
Mm-hmm.
Like appreciating them is usually my preferred term. But what long story. But basically, I have quite a few characters in the book who perceive themselves to be non-binary or trans and use they them pronouns, and they have all made very different choices around their chest. So one of them, all three of these particular individuals were assigned female at birth, but one of them chose to have a complete masculinization, complete mastectomy. Another one chose simply to have a reduction. And then another one chose to keep their fairly substantial full breasts because they identify as gender full, and they like to flip back and forth between being kind of high femme and butch, for lack of a better word. And so I am just not into normativity or conformity. And I'm, I joke that, I became a sociologist because I just couldn't really figure out what was going on in the social world around me in any other way. I'm kind of almost like it can be a little contrarian sometimes. And so you mentioned free the nipple, and I would love just to mention,
Absolutely. I want to, let's hear about it.
So when I first started this book, I really did not know how I felt about free the nipple.
Okay.
I mean, I thought, yeah, of course, sure. But is it the most important issue? Is this for 20 somethings with perky boobs, to
right.
it's, a lot of, 50-year-olds, maybe, or double Ds don't want to go top free, and, so I really did think about it a lot and did a lot of research into it. And I have come to the conclusion that it's a really fundamental right. And the way that Instagram and all our social media are acting as censors of women's bodies is a serious problem. And I think that partly has to do with the fact that one of the reasons women's breasts are so sexualized in America is that they're covered up. If things are on display all the time, they lose their kind of fetishistic, je ne sais quoi. And they lose that kind of potency. And potency sounds like a good thing, but in this instance, perhaps not, And so I did a lot of research into free the nipple. It's in both real life and in representation, because there's a real symbiosis. The book in general is an in-person, in real life book. But when it came to nipples, I really, and I deal with that in a chapter called Active Apexes, which is my bra designer chapter. And the reason I called it Active Apexes is because apex is the word the apparel industry uses for nipples. Because God forbid, in a corporate environment, you should utter the word nipple. Right. And
the apex,
or when writing an email to your the factory in Sri Lanka or Hong Kong. So what's really interesting is men were not allowed to go top free until the 1930s in America. And over a couple of hot summers in the 30s, when, of course, there was very high unemployment and a lot of very frustrated men in America. During the 1930s, over a couple of hot summers, they basically refused to abide by the law, went swimming topless or topless at all the beaches. It was called bareback swimming. And
Jesus.
and they won the right to New Jersey and New York overturned the requirement for men to wear those, black bathing suits that looked like women's bathing suits. There's a lot of really interesting material that I dug out of the archive in that particular part of the book, including the fact that the ACLU paved the way for Playboy by representing a magazine called Sunshine and Health. And Sunshine and Health were the official journal of the American Sunbathing Association. So they were like a nudist magazine. And the American Post Office kept confiscating the magazine. And so the ACLU represented Sunshine and Health because what they argued was that brown breasts were freely available in National Geographic, and that there was discrimination against white breasts, and this was unconstitutional. And so so they finally won their final appeal in early 1953, and Playboy came out in December 1953.
Wow. Oh, that's fascinating.
And, Playboy in its early days, of course, was all about the titties. It took a while for them to go bottomless.
Yeah. There's so much here. And I love the organization. I love the way that you highlighted these experts who are not your sort of typical academic experts. They're not the people who, you would think would be the people that you would go to for these insights. But of course, they're the people with some of the richest insights, and that make you think differently than maybe coming in with your preconceived notions, which is obviously in some ways one of the most important parts of a book like this, is to challenge our beliefs and to learn and to open our minds to these insights from individuals who have different life experiences from us. And so I'm just really, I don't know, I'm really grateful, for 6 years of work that you put into writing this, and the time that you spent with us today sharing it. And I just want to know if there's anything else kind of before we close that you want to make sure that gets on the record, damn it.
Well, I just really like to thank all the people who participated in the book, because when you become a character in the book, you're subject to quite a few interrogations. It goes beyond interviewing. And they're on the ground, present tense insights into, breasts in different ways, or, breasts through, what bra buyers say in focus groups in Columbus, Ohio, or whatever. I'm just so grateful that they were willing to share them with me. And I feel like it takes a village to write a book like mine. And there's been a lot of sisterhood and sorority, and I'm just really grateful for the women and others, some non-binary people, some men, trans and otherwise, who played ball with me.
Yeah. And we are so grateful for them and for you and for all of the information that you've shared with us today. So everybody, the book is Tits Up: What Sex Workers, Milk Bankers, Plastic Surgeons, Bra Designers, and Witches Tell Us About Breasts by Dr. Sarah Thornton. Sarah, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed the chat.
And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.